All right. I would like to welcome you to today's installment of the 30-minute workout series, where we'll be reviewing several ways to get more out of Civil 3D's tool palettes. My name is Jerry Bartels, and I'll be today's speaker. Assisting me on today's presentation are my colleagues Alan Gilbert, Angel Espinoza, and Jeff Bartels. While I'm running through the material, they will be in the background helping address any questions that come up along the way. If you've joined us for a previous 30-minute workout, welcome back. If you're new to the concept, I'm sure you would agree that traditional training courses focus almost exclusively on software features that you absolutely need to know for your job, immediately, almost as soon as you get back from the training. Anything beyond that is learned through some other means, or worse yet, has to be discovered during a lifetime of use. These sessions are dedicated to help shorten that learning curve. A couple of ground rules for our sessions. The examples that we show will be somewhat abstract in nature. We do this intentionally. By using more abstract examples, we can focus solely on how a tool functions. Once you understand how a tool works, you can apply it in any way that works best for your particular situation. We appreciate how valuable your time is, so we're always committed to starting and ending on time. There's no need to worry about taking notes. We move fairly quickly, so taking notes can be challenging. But we don't need to worry about that as much because the sessions are recorded and everyone that registers will get access to a recording. If you do have questions along the way, please post them in the Q&A pane and we'll try and answer them as we go through. If any questions remain at the end of the session, we will certainly get back to you with an answer. Finally, if you'd like to have a one-on-one follow-up call with any of us during or as a result of the session, please let us know. We always enjoy speaking with other users. So a brief agenda of what we'll be looking at today. We're going to talk about tool palettes. We're going to talk about how to create custom ones, adding content, editing content, and most importantly, how we can begin to start sharing those with others. This is, as always, a PowerPoint-free zone. So that means that we're going to spend the bulk of our time in the application and not in PowerPoint. So this is my last slide before hopping over to Civil 3D. So I'm in Civil 3D 2022. However, what I'm showing today will be applicable to prior versions of Civil 3D and essentially any AutoCAD-based application because those all support tool palettes. The tool palette that I have open on the screen is the default one that we start with, the Civil Imperial subassemblies. If you do not see a tool palette on your screen, if you hold down the Control key and hit 3, I'm doing that repeatedly now to turn it on and off. Your tool palette may not appear immediately on the screen. It may be docked somewhere. So if it doesn't show up, you just have to look around a little bit. You'll be able to find it. Speaking of docking and where it might go, think of it like the Properties palette. We've got tools that we can anchor it left and right. You can add transparency. You can do auto hide. We can even, as you click and start moving it around, you'll see as we get close to particular areas, it starts to dock. One thing that's always helped me, especially with screen real estate, sometimes if you're moving palettes around to have it closer to the area that you're working with, it has a tendency to want to dock, maybe if you don't want it to. If you hold down the Control key, you can move that palette anywhere you want, and it can't dock as long as Control is down. So keep that in the back of your mind. All right, so we've got a tool palette open. Let's talk a little bit about where this content comes from, because it'll be important to our discussion today. I'm going to type in options, and I'm going to look at the File tab here, and I'm going to come down near the bottom. There is a location here that says Tool Palette File Locations. What happens when we launch Civil 3D is it looks in this folder, and it grabs the tool palettes. In this case, each tab here represents a palette. So all of these palettes are defined in this location. Those are read into our environment. If we create new ones, make changes, whatever we do with these palettes, it has no impact on what's in these folders until we actually close the application. Not save the drawing, close the application, and then that information is written back to here. Okay, so we need to keep that in the back of our mind as we work. The other thing is, anytime you are doing any customization at all, I strongly encourage to create a copy of what it is that you'll be customizing before you get started. So in the event that you would like to restore back to what you had when you started your customization, it makes that process very easy rather than trying to roll those changes back out. So I have already created, as an example, if you go into this folder here, that's actually this folder on my machine. I've actually taken the contents of this folder and I've copied that into another folder on my machine that's called my in case of emergency. And here is my tool palettes folder. It is the same content that was pulled from here. All right, so you want to make sure and copy that. The other thing that I hang on to in my in case of emergency is a definition of all of my palette groups. I will show you that in a minute. And then I also keep like a text file that tells me what this folder is, because we have a tendency to bury that fairly deep into the computer. And if I don't know what it is, I don't want to have to dig for it. That gives me an easy way to be able to remember it. Okay, so we always want to back that up first before we get started. So we have backed that up, so we're ready to go. So if I'm going to get started, first thing I'm going to do is I'll look at creating a new tool palette. The palettes themselves, it's one of those things in our environment or in the interface that when in doubt, right click. There is a ton of right click functionality that we can use. If we right click on a tab for one of the palettes, I can create a new palette by selecting that and then giving it my name. Right clicking in other areas, we'll do other things as well. With my blank canvas, I'd like to start adding content to my palette. In most cases, folks immediately start thinking about blocks and other things that they would use repetitively. So I've got a block on the screen here. To put something on the tool palette is a drag and drop operation. And this is why it's so powerful and one of the most powerful parts of the interface, because unlike editing a CUI menu or something like that where you have to write code, and this is an entirely customization through drag and drop. So I'm going to highlight an object. I'm going to left pick, not on a grip, drag it onto my tool palette and drop it. We see an icon is created. We see the name of the block is added. And if I were to click and drag this in, it would allow me to reinsert that block. If you've done this before, there are probably a lot of folks that are cringing right now at what I just did. If you're not cringing, you should, because we have to understand if we put content on this palette, where it's drawn from. Because if we'd like to share it with other folks, we want to make sure that those folks can actually access the content. Because I dragged that block out of my drawing, it's literally looking in this drawing for that particular block. So if I made this available to other people, the question is, would they have access to this particular file to find this block? And odds are they wouldn't. So what I'm going to do is we'll delete this guy by right-clicking. And what I would do is I W block this out to another location and then bring that in from a location that's accessible by multiple people. So as an example, I'm going to look in Design Center here. We've done a whole session on Design Center. In Design Center, what we can do is drill down, kind of like Windows Explorer. We can find a drawing and then drill into that drawing and find content that's available to us, in this case, blocks. I can click and hold on that block now, drag that into here, right-click, come down to Properties, and see that now it is being pulled from a central location. That is one of the most critical things that we can do, ensuring that content is going to be accessible by the people that need it. At the same time, we can also go in and start tweaking this content. I don't just want to insert a block. I want to insert a block and start using some of my standards. So when that block is inserted, I'd like it to go on the P-trees layer. I could control line type or line weight. Color, I can automatically explode it for those blocks that in some case when we bring it in, we need to have it exploded. We can tweak any of that to match our standards. So it's not just an insertion, but instead we bring it in and it's automatically matching some of our standards. We can come in here and make some revisions to this. And in some cases, maybe we'll rename it, that instead of just a block name, I want some indication of what I'm going to be using it for. So this is for right-of-way trees. The icon that's here, you can specify a different image, light or dark. They're just PNG files primarily. I think other file formats are supported. If you needed to create something custom for what you're working in, one place to start, it's not the place to finish, but one place to start is if I go into Object Viewer, whatever I'm viewing in the Object Viewer, I can hit the Save button here, and it will save what I see as a PNG file. All right, the great part about that is I get all of the line work, but all of the stuff in the background is transparent. So if I use it directly, the line work's a little thin. I'd probably want to bring it into Photoshop or something, but I can create some quick custom icons with that fairly quickly. All right, so from here, I've got one tree. I don't want to be dragging individual things in. I'd like to do things more in mass. So if I were to come into this, I'd maybe grab a couple other things here. I'll say, here's my picnic table. I'll grab the hot tub, the sprinkler head, and the swimming pool. I'm going to right click on that, and I've got the ability to create a tool palette. So it creates a new tool palette from those objects. Maybe I brought that in because that's custom content that I always use. I could create a new from this palette view options. I could control how it's displayed. Instead of a list view, I could say icon with text. I could say just the icon, and I'd like to blow it up a little bit bigger so they're easier to see. You can come through here, and as well as tweak the properties, you can tweak how it's displayed to customize the experience that you're trying to create with this tool palette. I can also, using standard commands that I would use in Windows Explorer or anything else, I can click on the first one, shift click on the last one. I can start to copy things between palettes. So if I wanted to bring that into here, I could take and paste those and then they're ready to go. If I wanted to bring something in like the picnic table, we drag it in, it comes in and it's dropped, it's in its standard rotation. I'd like to do something different with that because I'm not always going to have it vertical. We could come into properties, and any of these things that we see in here, for example, prompt for rotation, we'll set that to yes. If I were to execute that command now, bring it in, I can now rotate it. It's like, hey, that's a fantastic tool. I'd like to use that everywhere. Well, I can, because if I hold down the shift key and select these, I can right click, come into properties, and then we can start making changes to these things in mass. All right, so now all of those would support rotation. Okay, so very, very easy to work with, very intuitive. I could add other things, geometry that I'm working with. Clicking on it once to highlight it, clicking on it again without a grip will allow me to add it here. Whatever that geometry is that I've brought in, I would then be able to execute in the future. If you see an arrow here, that's actually a flyout. We see that by dragging the circle in, we get a flyout with all of these other options, almost the whole draw menu. Maybe I don't want that. I can go to properties, and because it's specific to that command, use the flyout, yes or no. Maybe use the flyout, but only give me those things that have some circular component to it. We'll say okay, and now if I were to grab that, I'd have different options available to me that way. Okay, so we can, I'll move this guy over here. We can do this with hatch. We'll pick and hold, drag the hatch up onto the dialog. The beautiful part about it, whatever our standards were, it will maintain that. So these can be brought in, whether it's this drawing or the next one. If those layers don't exist, they'll automatically be created. It's a fantastic way that folks can focus on content and not necessarily on standards. I have other hatch patterns that I use here. I want to bring this up because I used to do this kind of like a paint by numbers type deal. But if you create gradient hatches, if you're going to drag one of those onto the tool palette, the interesting thing is rather than pick and then left pick and hold, we have to pick again, and then left pick and hold, and then drag it on there. All right, why we have to do that? That's a great question. I wish I had a great answer for you, but I don't. Just know that if I'm going to do things with gradient hatch, we have to do 3 picks. From here, I would go through and start to label this as this is what I want for my right of way. This is what I want for water. So that in the future, I mean, literally, I could start creating exhibits by a paint by number type of approach. And as I create my exhibit, whether it's in this drawing or the next one, everything remains consistent. We can add some other things like perhaps text. We'll grab this guy, drag it on. I'm going to rename it that this is title, because that's what the purpose of the text is. If I were to use it again, I'm going to pick out here, specify height. I'm going to hit enter, rotation angle 0. And if I start to type my sample text, I see it's much larger than what I expected. I'm going to highlight this text and I'm going to look at properties, and I see its height is currently set to 6. Well, that's what I want to use for my title text. So hopefully if I right click on this, there'll be some options that I can tweak that as well. If I look under text, I don't have any options to control the height. If I look at general, I don't have any options to control the height. These are the things that we have the ability to configure for everything. But does that mean that I can't do it? Absolutely not. If we look at the top up here, the way that any of these commands are executed, if they're macros, we can come in here and tweak that. So for example, if I wanted the text to be fixed at 6 in this case, I'm going to say dtext, I would hit enter, would be a semicolon. The next thing dtext is going to ask me for is an insertion point. So I'll do a backslash. That'll pause for an insertion. The next thing that it's going to ask me for is height. I'll say 6, and then I'll hit enter and I'll allow the command to continue as it went. We'll say, okay, come in here for my title, come down here and pick. It automatically goes to rotation angle 0, and I can say exhibit A to put that in. Okay, we can do full-on commands themselves. If I right-click in this area, I'm going to come down. There is an option that I can say customize commands. If we go into customize commands, it gives me access to all of the commands that are in the system, whether they be Civil 3D, whether they be whatever menu's loaded, vehicle tracking, map, whatever I want. Let's do something here like we'll just say plot for right now. I'll take the plot command, I'll drag that onto my menu here, and we'll drop that. All right. This tool palette is, an incredibly powerful tool in that we can manage content, not only what the content does as far as insertion, we can maintain standards. We can also customize it so that as we put things in, it'll match our standards as well as, whatever the intention is for this particular item. We can also use any of the commands that are in the interface. So if we start thinking about that, we can do some other things with this. We can say add text, and I could start looking at it as like a workflow. So like step X, so 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever that may be. So we'll take and paste a couple of these, and I can move this up. Maybe for this particular workflow, step 1 is adding some geometry. Maybe step 2 is going through and enhancing how that geometry is displayed. Maybe step 3 is going through and doing some annotation. Maybe step 4 is actually going to be the output. All right, so I could create a tool palette that goes through a specific workflow to meet my needs within the organization. All right, then we start thinking about it a little bit more. I don't want a tool palette that's 5 foot long. I may have other palettes, like some things are repetitive. I could actually have a palette or a tab that is step 1, step 2, step 3 for a particular task that I'm doing in survey or a particular task that I'm doing in design. So that if I've got newer folks, I want them to follow, the menus and stuff are fantastic with the conceptual ribbons and things like that. But in some cases, if I want to kind of hold them by the hand or dictate the order in which they need to go, or even if it's something I don't do on a regular basis, having these broken down in palettes can be incredibly powerful. Now, looking at that, I've got all these tabs here. I don't want 500 tabs to work with either. I would just want a collection of the tabs that I need for my particular workflow. So I'm going to right click on this. Where do I see where these are? Well, there's a number of them that are in here already. So I could say, for example, multi-view blocks. If you've not poked around in here, very powerful stuff in here. I mean, you've got tons of landscaping things with trees. You got building footprints. You got park benches, playground equipment, fences, different utility poles, signage, all types of stuff that can be done with this. But these are grouped into different collections of palettes, or what's a palette group. So what I can do, I can select the ones that I want because this is where I created my palette. It's part of the Imperial subassemblies. Where we can find those is if we go to customize palettes, here are all the palettes that are loaded from that options folder we looked at initially. And then these are groups that have been created, all right, just like folders. And then these palettes have been dragged into here to populate these different collections or groups of palettes, all right, for like maybe different workflows or, whatever purpose you'd like to use in your particular situation. Okay, if I look at this, the civil subassemblies, we see Jerry's the 4th one down. Say Jerry should be at the top. So I'll move that up. We'll see that it automatically updates this here. Okay. Now, I told you to save the tool palette folder earlier. It's very important that if I right click, I can export on the first one all of my tool palette groups. All of those are currently in my in case of emergency tool palette group folder, I save that off ahead of time. That's very important because once again, as we're experimenting or customizing here, if I'd like to go back to the defaults, I'd like to be able to do that quickly without having to walk backwards through what I did. So I have created a palette. I've looked at different content and things that can be put on here. I've talked about commands. Those commands are not limited to menu items. They could be custom macros you've created. They could be list routines. They could be the action recorder. They can be pretty much almost anything that is valid within the application can be put into this palette. Now, if I'd like to share this with somebody, if I come over here to the side, here is my Jerry palette. All right, I'm going to right click on that and I'm going to export it. If I export that palette, it's going to export it to an XTP file, which is my exported tool palette. We'll come out to my desktop here. I've got a 30-minute workout folder that I'm just going to save that. And what I could do now, if my intent is I've created something, I'd like to share that with somebody else, I could give them access to the file in that folder, and they would bring it in and it would populate it on their machine. They would now have an independent copy of mine. As long as they had access to all this content, they would be able to reach that as well. But I'm saying to myself, you know, I'd maybe like to take that one step further. I'd like to take it to the point where I start with all my civil stuff that I can do what I want with. But then maybe I'd like a shared location that everybody can access. And if we update that, then those updates are available to everybody. How would I do that? Well, what I'm going to do, I've exported this. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to remove this. So that's out. Here's my new palette that we created earlier. I'm going to remove that. So that guy's out. And now my civil is pretty much back to the way that it was. Okay. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to create my shared location. This would be out on my network somewhere. I've got a folder I've created called 30-minute workout tool palettes. This is where all of my folks are going to access. It's empty right now. I need to populate it with the tool palette information. So here is my tool palette folder. I need some structure in which to hold the tool palettes. Because my folder is empty, I need to build that structure. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to go into options. I'm going to come down to tool palettes. I'm going to select my folder here. I'm going to browse and I'm going to go to the folder that has that where I'll be saving it. It's empty right now. We'll say open and I'm going to say apply. When I do that, it just flushed all my templates, all right, or all my palettes. Why? Because it's reading what's in here and it's showing it to me here. Civil stuff's not in there. That folder was empty, so this is all I see. If I come out and look at that folder now, we see that it's created the structure for me to work. All right, so I've just created an environment that is unique, a place that could be shared, that now I can start saving some things. So let's do this. I'm going to right-click on this, Customize Tool Palettes. I'm going to right-click on this, and we'll import the custom one that I created. So off my desktop here, we'll grab my Jerry folder or my Jerry palette. I don't need this new palette here, so we'll take that out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say close. And then the next thing that I'm going to do is, remember, I've populated this, but it doesn't actually get written back to the system until I close out of the application. So I'm going to close out of the application, save changes to the drawing. It's irrelevant. Not if you want to keep it, you want to save it. But in my case, it'll have no impact on whether that folder gets written or not. It's when I close the application. If we come out and look at that folder now, we'll see that on my C drive, here is my tool palette catalog. Here is the palettes, and we see that that information was written out. So let's launch Civil 3D again. So if we launch Civil 3D, we'll bring that up for us on the screen. All right, it's now pointed to that shared location where I've got content. What I'd like to do is start adding back my civil stuff that I flushed away to go through this process. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll go into options. Make sure I have my fingers on the right keys here. So we'll go into options. What I'm going to do is now, instead of flushing this one. We'll keep this one here. I'm going to add a new folder to it. Okay. And I'm going to browse and I'm going to go find the folder. Now, this is why you want to write it down, because if I need to go back to it, I got to remember where it is. All right. It's pretty easy to find. It's under, actually, it's under users. I said it was easy to find. I was kidding. Users will go, Jerry will go app data, we'll go roaming, we'll say Autodesk, we'll say Civil 3D 2022, ENU support, kind of rolls off the tongue, and then we'll go to tool palette. And we'll say open, and then I'm going to say apply. All right, it has just applied that information, so my civil stuff is back. I'm going to move my my civil stuff up in the stack just because I don't want anything that I've created perhaps to impact what it reads first. And then we'll say okay. So we'll come here and look at my customized palettes. Here is my Jerry tool or palette, and here are all my civil ones. But you'll notice, because I flushed the civil palettes before they're gone, I need to refresh them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete these and I'm going to re-import the ones that we saved off. So from in case of emergency, we're going to go into the tool palette groups. We're going to repopulate those and bring those in. Then what I'm going to do, let's set this current like the we normally have it with the civil stuff. I'm going to create a new group. I'm going to call this shared content, and I'm going to say locked because I want to make sure this is locked down. We haven't locked it yet. It doesn't lock it by me saying that. I just want that to be an indicator of what that content is. All right, because I've done that, I've created a new group and put Jerry in it. It's automatically added it to my list. I'll click on shared content. Locked, there is my my Jerry content that is in the central location. Here is my Civil Imperial like we had before. Everything is working like I'd like it to, with one exception. I want to make sure that the Civil 3D or the Jerry stuff that I have created is locked. Why do I want to make sure that it's locked? I want to make sure that it's locked because remember, it reads the data in. We make changes to it, and when we close, it writes it back out. I don't want anybody else to make changes or anything like that. So the way that we're going to do that, I'm going to exit out of the application. I'm going to come to that folder. So we'll say C. We'll go to 30-minute workout tool palettes. I'm going to go to properties, and I'm going to set that catalog to read only. I'm going to go to palettes. I'm going to go to properties. I'm going to set that all to read only. We'll say okay. That is good to go. Let's fire up Civil 3D one more time. And when this comes up, we'll see that we are sharing that content. It's in a separate location, and that that location has now been locked down to where people can't make changes to it. So the civil stuff remains as it was. And if I right click on this guy and go to my shared content locked, we see that that folder is now locked. And if someone were to come in here and try and delete this or make changes to it, that information is locked down and they can't do it. Okay, so one more example of how we would go about sharing that. All right, so with that, let me hop back to here. Look at the, we talked about creating the palettes, adding and editing content, sharing with others. This is really kind of the first step in the journey. I want to give you some ideas of what can be done. This is not every step of everything that can be done. We can actually extend this much further. Where we can learn more about that, AU is coming up again here the beginning of October. It is free. Once again this year, it is virtual, and registration is open. So I would strongly encourage you to register for AU to learn about these types of topics, but then others as well. There are two folks that have fantastic classes that talk in more detail on using tool palettes. Matt Murphy and Paul Munford both have sessions. You can see they were done a couple of years ago, but they are still applicable today. They will actually go into some of the different approaches on, okay, how do I set it up that maybe through profiles so that I can have an admin that can edit that, but then the users are in a state that they can't. They show some other ways for the managing or the maintenance of that those workflows or those palettes, how you could leverage that, or extend that functionality moving forward. So with that, in the interest of time, we're getting close to the top of the hour. Any questions that have not yet been addressed during the session, we will absolutely get back to you with an answer. On behalf of Alan, Angel, Jeff, and myself, I'd like to thank you for attending our session. We know your time is valuable, and we appreciate you investing some of that time with us. And we look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks. See ya.